How many people have read through all of it or most of it? Just leave it up for another minute. People are finishing. So we just talked about all the different topics we're going to go through in the course. What key, in this just few paragraphs, what key development issues come out of this woman's daily story, or what key issues came through? It was a long walk. There wasn't adequate access to education. They can only send one child. They send their son, maybe their oldest son. Yeah. And that took hours of her time every day just walking to get water. Would the rains come this year? There was a line, if the rains come, yeah. Access to health, there's mention of an HIV clinic, having a persistent cough, not really, at least she does have some access to a clinic, but again, it's a struggle to get that access. Yeah, so undernutrition being a key factor here, and the mother's undernutrition translating into potential nutritional deficits for the kid. Yeah. That's right, so there's this foreign aid, maybe sack of grain in the corner, and she uses it to sort of sew the little girl's dress. Yeah. Within household, gender inequality comes out here very, very clearly. Yeah. Yeah, so infrastructure and transportation and lack of access to maybe good roads or good public transport affects all of these decisions in some sense. So that could be very, very important. Yeah. That's right. Maybe there's really no forest nearby, and they're kind of depleting forest farther and farther away. And so when that runs out, what do they do? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, population issues or family size could be very important, and they're really on the edge. This is a family where this little girl's dress was ripped, and that's a really big deal. If you don't have clothes to wear and you can't afford clothes, what do you do? And so thankfully she was able to sort of keep it going. There's a lot of symbolism in just having that last bit of thread, maybe from a foreign aid bag, just to hold this thin piece of cloth together for her daughter. Yeah. Yeah, inadequate quantity of water just to do basic washing of self and clothes and maybe pots and pans when you're cooking, and that can lead to a whole range of health problems. That's right, the brackish water. So both water quality and quantity are both basically very important issues here. Yeah. Exactly. In terms of respiratory infections. Okay, so again, just a few paragraphs, we see the daily challenges hour by hour that this woman is facing and her household are facing and how she's trying to navigate them and survive, but she's on the edge. So they have enough food for now, but maybe the rains won't come. They have enough clothing, just enough for their kids now, but maybe it'll get ripped and they won't know what to do. What if that school that her son walks to closes for some reason and maybe there's no access to schooling, etc. So this isn't a portrait of someone in the middle of a war or a portrait of someone in the most extreme circumstances. This is a normal day. So then you can imagine after an economic shock or political instability or a drought year, folks who are just surviving here go off the cliff. And that's going to be something we're going to come back to at different points, just how precarious people's existence can be if they're living on $1 a day and how that affects their economic choices. So again, we're not going to bring individual stories in every lecture, and that's not the goal of this class, but I want us to have it in mind and sort of start the class with a human being's life at the front of our mind and think about how all the statistics relate to her and her family. Was there a hand up in the back that I saw? I saw a hand there. Okay. So let's get to some of the statistics. I actually skipped over a couple slides and talk about patterns of global development and try to put this story in context. So in terms of population and land area, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of 4 major developing regions. There's East Asia, Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, in terms of population, East Asia is dominated by China. In terms of population, South Asia is dominated by India. But there are other large, high-population countries in those regions. Of these 4 regions, Sub-Saharan Africa has had the worst economic performance over the last roughly 40 years. Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest region today in terms of per capita income levels. Sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to go through all these in a minute. We're going to go through the stats. Has the shortest life expectancy, has bad educational measures. Sub-Saharan African countries experience a lot of political violence and civil war. We could go on and on. Sub-Saharan Africa has by far the most HIV/AIDS. So in terms of the answer to the very important question asked before, why Africa? Why are we spending time on Africa? Sub-Saharan Africa is the world's poorest region. So when we're thinking about underdevelopment challenges, it's the natural place to start in many ways. That's not to say there aren't major issues of underdevelopment that need to be dealt with in South Asia or Middle East, North Africa, which I didn't even put up here as a major region, but it is an important region, or in Latin America. There are, even in East Asia, for all the, obviously the press reports and all the great economic success in China, there are hundreds of millions of people in China living in extreme poverty still in rural areas. So there are development challenges globally. There are poverty challenges in our own country that are quite pronounced. There are 50 million people who are surviving in part on food stamps, for instance. So this isn't, by focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa and saying Sub-Saharan Africa is so poor, we're not exoticizing Africa, we're not saying it's fundamentally different. The problems we're going to talk about are found in all world regions. They're just most concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's going to be our sort of starting point. As I mentioned before, there are these sort of 3-pronged issues. We want to understand the African context. We want to get a sense of the real challenges facing this region, which again are similar to the challenges facing other regions. We want to understand specific economic policies and public policies, and to understand those policies, we're going to appeal to economic theory and different concepts. But then we're really going to, more than anything, dive into the kinds of tools we can apply to these programs, policies, and challenges to try to understand what might work to promote development, to promote income growth, to lead to better health, to lead to better water access, etc. And along the way, learn a lot of applied econometrics that you could use with whatever you want to apply to in any sector. So those are kind of the 3 legs of the stool here. This is a world map, and what's nice about this world map is it's actually an equal area map. So do you have a hand up in the back? Yeah. Yeah, so I think the generalizability issue is very important. We might care if it only affected Africa with 800 million, sub-Saharan Africa with 800 million people, but generalizability remains important. And it's something we're going to circle back to at times during the course, not in every lecture, not every time, but I encourage all of you, if there is a particular finding or conclusion we're reaching based on certain studies, to bring up the issue of generalizability. Would this program work in India? Yes or no? Why or why not? That's really interesting and important to think through. And some of the factors that might affect whether a program that works in Africa works, say, in Asia might be the different income levels in those regions, or the different educational levels, et cetera. We can try to think through a bit more conceptually why certain results would travel well or wouldn't travel well. So I welcome you to bring that up. That'll enrich the discussion of the lecture. Okay, so this is the equal area map. The maps we usually look at are, imagine you had an orange and you wanted to flatten it out. That's sort of what you do when you take a globe and you try to put it on paper, and there's no good way to kind of flatten that orange, right? You have to sort of make certain assumptions. The assumption that's often made in the maps we look at exaggerate the size of the extreme northern hemisphere and the extreme southern hemisphere. So in a lot of the maps we all grew up looking at, Greenland looks really big. Greenland isn't that big, actually. It's pretty small. Canada, northern Canada looks like bigger than Latin America, but it's not. It's really not that big. So that's why I like this map, because it's an equal area map. The size of countries here reflects their actual land area. And the thing that jumps out at you immediately, sub-Saharan Africa is really big. Sub-Saharan Africa is a lot bigger than North America. It doesn't look like it in the traditional map, but it's much bigger. And Sub-Saharan Africa is way bigger than Europe. Multiple times bigger than Europe. So you kind of wonder, people of course commented on this, that the early European cartographers, in some sense, were exaggerating the size of their own territories for their own maybe political reasons. Brazil looks really big here too. So the sort of tropical and subtropical Latin American regions look much bigger than they do in traditional maps. If we zoom in on Sub-Saharan Africa, here we have basically a political map of Sub-Saharan Africa with all the country names. I know you can't really see those too well because of the coloring, but this is actually Africa as a whole. We're going to focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a couple of reasons why we do that, as opposed to looking at Africa as a whole. You could alternatively look at Africa as a whole, and there could be other good reasons to do that. But some of the reasons we're looking at Sub-Saharan Africa in particular is, A, traditionally scholarship has divided North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. There are political scientists and economists and sociologists and historians who have treated these as different units. So they have been often separate units of study, and there's literature and scholarship sort of organized in that way. So that's not a very good intellectual reason, but it's a practical reason for doing so. That's one difference. Of course, there are very long-standing historical ties between the countries above and below that line, the red line on the screen, and many countries straddle the line. They sort of have feet in North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa as it's traditionally defined. So there's clearly no one-to-one correspondence. There are nations that straddle. There's been trade since time immemorial across the Sahara, etc. But there are some distinctions. There are some linguistic distinctions between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. There are some religious distinctions. Of course, it's a continuum, but there are some historical, linguistic, and religious distinctions that have been seen as very salient among scholars in the past. And we're going to continue making this distinction in what we talk about this term. What I'd like us to do is think about times we could bring in North African cases, similarities between North African countries and Sub-Saharan African countries. That's going to be valuable in terms of the generalizability point. There's another very practical reason for dividing North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa, which is, if you compare the North African countries to the Sub-Saharan African countries, even the ones right straddling the line, income levels are very different. So the North African countries often have an order of magnitude higher income levels than their neighbors just to the south in the standard cross-country income statistics. So there are also real economic realities that could cause us to look at economic and political and policy issues differently, say, in Chad, which is covered by the red line, versus Libya, or in Sudan versus Egypt, or in Niger versus Algeria. In all those cases, the North African countries are much richer in per capita income terms, infrastructure development, et cetera, than the countries just south of them. So that's going to be the plan for the term. But again, cross-regional neighboring comparisons will be very useful. Let me pause and see what people's thoughts or reactions are to that distinction. Yeah. We will at times, and in what I'm going to show you in a couple slides today, if I get to it, or if not, then definitely on Thursdays, even within Sub-Saharan Africa, there are large differences in a lot of measures between the regions that you mentioned. And so taking the view of saying Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole is in some sense a naive view, just like saying India as a whole is naive, because there are regions of India that are much richer than other regions of India. Same thing for rural China and urban China, et cetera. So when we're talking about 800 million people across a vast continent, there are going to be huge differences, and we are going to talk about some of those differences throughout the term. And when we get to the end of the term and some of the success stories that have had rapid growth compared to their neighbors, those differences are going to be very apparent. But it's a very important point, and let's keep it in mind, especially when we get to some of the human development statistics today and on Thursday. Other comments or thoughts about the kind of setup? Yeah. Yeah, so they differ in some ways, and maybe less in others. In terms of income, they differ a lot. In terms of educational levels, it's a bit more mixed. There are certainly Sub-Saharan African countries with very good educational statistics. In terms of life expectancy, because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, in part, and because of the tropical disease burden, health measures are much worse in Sub-Saharan Africa than they are in North Africa. There's still lots of health problems in North Africa, but the combination of a more temperate climate and much lower rates of HIV/AIDS mean that the health scene is really different. So that's another big distinction. Now again, the point before is relevant in the sense that even HIV/AIDS, so HIV prevalence rates differ across different parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll talk about that. There are parts of West Africa where HIV prevalence is quite low relative to Eastern and Southern Africa, for instance. So we'll talk about those distinctions, but there is a big difference with North Africa. Yeah. Yeah, we will talk about South Africa. South Africa has its own special history in some ways. There are ways in which its history is similar to especially the settler colonies in East Africa, but it does have a distinct history, and towards the end of the semester in particular, we will talk about some aspects of South Africa. But South Africa isn't going to be the focus of this course. We have a whole other course on South Africa. Its history is so fascinating in many ways, and continues to be. But yeah. We'll talk a little bit about inequality. It's going to come out when we talk about rural and urban development a bit. The inequality statistics are uneven across African countries. So we don't have perfect measures. There are data out there on inequality, but they're far from perfect. So it's not going to, even though when we talk about, say, investing in the education and the health of the poor, there's clear implications for inequality, we're not going to focus on inequality as a separate topic per se. It's just something that's going to come through again and again when we talk about, especially the rural poor. Implicit in that is inequality, but we're not going to focus on inequality as a separate topic in the course. In the back. Yeah, I'm going to show you that in a couple slides, about 800 million. So I'll talk about the population of all those major regions we talked about and how they're changing over time, because that's an interesting part of the story. There's some very major, I think we're probably going to get to that next time because it'll take me a little time to get there, but there are major changes in global demographics that are on the way that all demographers predict, and sub-Saharan Africa is right in the middle of that story. Yeah.
With the discrepancies in income right along the border between Sub-Saharan Africa and Africa, we can hear things that people have about discontinuity, because it's like very similar geographically, but
People have used borders and geography in regression discontinuity type approaches in the past. They have. And I think there may be, I don't know if I have to remember if I took this paper off or not. There may be one application of it we'll get to. Okay. So I already showed you this story, so let me just jump ahead. Let's get to some statistics. And I realize that maybe with a room of this size, the font may be too small, so my guess is in the back you can't see those slides. Can you see them? Yeah, you can't really see them. Okay, I'll try to have bigger font next time, so apologies for that. So what are these different columns? What we have here is the different regions on the left, the Arab states, East Asia, Europe and Central Asia, and there they really mean sort of Eastern Europe. It's more the former communist territory, Soviet and Soviet dominated. Latin America and Caribbean and South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And what I'm presenting up here are the inputs into what's called the United Nations Development Programme's HDI, Human Development Index. And what they do is they combine information across countries' life expectancy, schooling measures, and per capita income, and they combine them into the score that takes on a value between 0 and 1, where 1 means you're really, really rich, and 0 means you're really, really poor. Like if you had very low life expectancy, no schooling, and just everybody lived in extreme poverty, you'd be close to 0, something like that. So what we see here there are some stark differences across regions. Again, apologies if you can't see this, but for the top 4 regions, life expectancy is in the low 70s. For South Asia, it's in the 60s, and for Sub-Saharan Africa, it's in the 50s. Now, as we mentioned briefly before, part of the reason why life expectancy in Sub-Saharan Africa is in the 50s is because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which we will talk about extensively in the course. That has knocked many years off life expectancy in many countries. But even before HIV/AIDS, Sub-Saharan Africa had the lowest life expectancy of any developing region. The tropical disease burden is very high, malnutrition is high, etc. So for all those reasons, infant mortality is high. For all those reasons, life expectancy is low. In fact, for very poor countries, the infant mortality rate plays a key role in driving life expectancy, actually. So those are the different factors. When we move over to schooling, we see the same sort of pattern. The top 4 regions have 10 to 13 years of schooling on average. South Asia is about 10 years. Sub-Saharan Africa is about 9 years. Now, the 9 years actually is a big improvement. And we're going to talk about that. One of the dimensions of human development where Sub-Saharan African countries, for the most part, have made major strides is in education. And the gap between, say, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia is relatively narrow in that dimension. Now, there is going to be, when we break it down by sub-region in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's going to be major regional variation in this number. The West African countries tend to have much lower years of schooling attainment than the East African and Southern African countries. And we'll talk about the details next time, because it's 3:30, so we'll pick up from there. Thanks.